In 1966, the Beach Boys were more popular in the UK than the Beatles. So how did that happen? I'm Andrew from Parlogram, and in this video, I'll tell you why, and find out how they influenced each other to make some of the greatest music ever made. Back in 1998, I was listening to the Beach Boys more than I was the Beatles, and the reason for that was this CD. Endless Harmony was a major documentary about the Beach Boys and was serialised on British television in September 1998. Because I was at that time living in Prague, my parents would tape episodes of it for me on VHS tapes and send them over to me. I recorded the Endless Harmony CD onto cassette and listened to it almost every day for months on my Walkman here. So needless to say, I was really excited about the new documentary, which has just premiered on Disney+. Despite being half an hour shorter than Endless Harmony, I really enjoyed the new film. Sure, it could have been 8 hours longer, and yes, it glossed over many areas of their story, but getting such a documentary onto a mainstream platform these days has to be applauded and appreciated. And of course, it inspired me to make this video. So let's get into it. Capitol, when presented with the Beatles' first 4 British singles, had no idea what to do with them, and so famously passed on them. In the UK, faced with the Beach Boys' early singles, EMI had the same problem, but they took the decision to release them. This group of oddly dressed, square-looking boys singing songs about surfing and Little Deuce Coups might as well have been singing in a foreign language as far as Brits were concerned in 1963. That, coupled with the quality and quantity of British groups around at that time, meant that their records stood very little chance of success. In fact, out of the 17 singles Capitol released to the Beach Boys in the States between 1962 and 1965, only 7 managed to get into the UK chart, the highest of which being I Get Around, which reached number 7 in July 1964. And the album situation was even worse, not helped by a very odd release schedule. Their first album, Surfin' Safari, didn't appear in the UK until 6 months after its US release, and their second album, Surfin' USA, wasn't released in the UK until August 1965, nearly 2.5 years after its US debut. Little Deuce Coupe was held back in the UK until October 1965, again a good 2 years after its US release. Surfer Girl was briefly released in 1964, but flopped so badly it didn't see the light of day again until it was reissued in 1967. The Beach Boys concert appeared in February 1965, followed by All Summer Long that June. But as good as these albums were, they failed to gain any significant traction in the charts. But then came the year everything changed.
1966!
The Beach Boys' Party album appeared in the States in November 1965. However, EMI held it back in the UK until February 1966. That turned out to be perfect timing, as a track from it, Barbara Ann, gave the Beach Boys their biggest UK hit to date when it got to number 3 that April. Suddenly, the Beach Boys were now the biggest American pop group in Britain. So, how did that happen? Until 1967, hearing pop music on the radio in the UK wasn't easy, as there were no national pop music radio stations. The BBC had only limited time to play records, and pop music programmes like Saturday Club and Top Gear relied heavily on live sessions and tended to favour British groups. From the late 1950s until 1963, Radio Luxembourg had been the place to go to listen to pop music. But in 1964, things changed with the arrival of these guys.
Wonderful Radio London.
Broadcasting from vessels such as converted minesweepers, the pirate radio stations anchored themselves off the coast of Britain, just outside what was called the 3-mile limit, which meant that they were not bound by British broadcasting regulations. With ships in both northerly and southerly waters, their signal could be picked up by every teenager's transistor radio in the country.
And we'll have that thing off as well, thank you. What?
Funded by advertisers and supported secretly by the record companies, they were, before the government shut them down in 1967, the most important and most listened to pop music radio stations in the country. They were the only place you could hear American artists like the Beach Boys, Jan and Dean, Jay and the Americans, to name but a few. And there's no doubt that their contribution helped make the Beach Boys one of the biggest selling bands in the UK. Released on December 3rd, 1965, Rubber Soul marked a significant shift both in songwriting and attitude from the Beatles' previous album, Help. Although released just a few months apart, the songwriting on this album, like the Beatles themselves, had become more introspective and mature. However, reviews for it in the British music press were decidedly mixed. One journalist in Record Mirror marvelled at their constant stream of melodic ingenuity, but concluded by saying that it was, quote, not perhaps their best LP in terms of variety, though instrumentally it's a gas. Another reviewer in the same paper said that previous Beatles LPs have been well above average. Help and Beatles for Sale were in a class of their own. But Rubber Soul is nowhere near so good. Someone must know the reason why. Certainly I don't. Judging LPs strictly on their merits, recent albums from Manfred Mann, the Beach Boys and Jerry Lee Lewis rank high above Rubber Soul. Now, the Rubber Soul, which was released by Parlophone in the UK, was quite different to the one released on Capitol in the US. Capitol's version not only opened up each side with a track from the UK Help album, it also left off Drive My Car, Nowhere Man, What Goes On, and If I Needed Someone, giving it, some say, a folkier vibe. For Brian Wilson, this was the greatest album he'd ever heard. Although it's unknown exactly which version Brian heard first, it doesn't really matter. Brian Wilson saw Rubber Soul as a complete statement, a concept album if you like, and for him it broke the mould of a pop album being just a collection of filler tracks built around a couple of hit singles. So inspired was he when he'd listened to it, that he rushed to his wife and proclaimed, "Marilyn, I'm going to make the greatest album. The greatest rock album ever made." And he did. By 1966, tired of Beatlemania, the thinking and policy behind John and Paul's songwriting had changed. They decided to stop writing about sex and instead write about things. However, Brian Wilson was going in the other direction. Songs about things, i.e. cars and surfing, were ditched in favour of songs which delved deeper into feelings and relationships. It was a theme he'd begun to explore on the Beach Boys' Today album, which, although was released in the States in March 1965, didn't come out in the UK until April 1966. On May 16, 1966, Bruce Johnson and ex-Beatles publicist and now the Beach Boys publicist Derek Taylor arrived in London for a working holiday. They'd brought with them a test pressing of Pet Sounds, and their plan was to go around the local music scenes, playing and promoting it. By spring 1966, EMI was finally seeing some success with the Beach Boys in the UK. Although Caroline No flopped, Sloop John B made it to number 2 in the charts on May the 25th, helped by filmed clips shown on Top of the Pops on April the 28th. Now, EMI's original plan had been to release Pet Sounds in November 1966 to coincide with the band's tour of Britain, but events that occurred during Bruce Johnston's trip made them change their mind. After being shown around town by Keith Moon, which must have been a laugh, they, along with a small group of journalists and musicians, who included John Lennon and Paul McCartney, crowded into Johnson and Taylor's hotel room for a playback of the Pet Sounds album. Not just once, but twice, at least. Everyone was stunned, not least John and Paul, who immediately recognised it as the masterpiece it was. This reaction then forced EMI to change their mind about November, and instead Rush released it on June the 27th. Pet Sounds takes you on an emotional journey like no other album I know. From the excitement and optimism of Wouldn't It Be Nice, through the complete devotion of God Only Knows, to the disappointment and despair of Caroline No. For me, this album is on a whole different level to Rubber Soul, and as time would tell, it was only when the Beatles, like Wilson, were allowed to develop in the studio, free from the burden of touring, that they produced their greatest work. Pet Sounds debuted on the UK album chart at number 13, and the music press hailed it as both the most progressive pop album ever and the greatest album ever made. After which, it went on to spend 6 months in the top 10. More success followed when the third single from the album, God Only Knows, backed with Wouldn't It Be Nice, peaked to number 2 for 2 weeks on August the 31st. An expanded version of the US edition of the Best of the Beach Boys album filled the vacant November release date, and this album stayed at number 2 for 5 weeks, helping the Beach Boys become the strongest-selling album act in the UK for the final quarter of 1966. Although largely sticking to their guns on Revolver writing songs about things, Paul was so inspired by God Only Knows that he composed what he and John regarded as one of, if not the best songs he ever wrote.
To lead a better life, I need my love to be here.
Begun at Abbey Road on June the 14th, 1966, Here, There and Everywhere took an unprecedented 16 hours to record, and the majority of that time was spent on the Beach Boys-inspired harmonies. Paul says in his book The Lyrics, "In terms of circularity though, it's hard to beat the fact that Here, There and Everywhere was influenced most immediately by the Beach Boys' God Only Knows from Pet Sounds. What's really interesting is that God Only Knows was itself inspired by Brian Wilson's repeated listening to our songs on Rubber Soul." Pet Sounds' influence on Paul McCartney was not just limited to that one song. It could be heard throughout Sgt. Pepper and at other points through his career. Sadly, its planned follow-up, Smile, never materialised as originally planned. Had it done so, it would have perhaps equalled the heights reached by Sgt. Pepper. The Beatles, of course, suffered their own problems post-Pepper, but ended their career on a high with Abbey Road. The Beach Boys never had their Abbey Road moment, and despite a run of fine albums between 1967 and 1971, none matched the achievements of Pet Sounds. So what's the best way to experience this album? Well, here are my recommendations. As Pet Sounds was originally mixed by Brian Wilson to full-track mono only, a true stereo mix was not created at the time of its release. Instead, Capitol created a fake duophonic mix, which unfortunately became the default version for many, many years. However, this original US mono first pressing doesn't sound particularly great either. Neither does the UK one, so don't go forking out big money for that. If you want to experience this album as it was intended, i.e. in mono, the best version in my opinion is the DCC pressing, mastered from an analog tape by Steve Hoffman in 1995. It's not cheap, and the vinyl will cost you about $200 today, but the CD is around half that. But for most, stereo is going to be the way to go. The album's first true stereo mix didn't happen until 1997, when it appeared on the magnificent Pet Sounds Sessions box set. It was then remastered in 2001 and 2006, and again for its 50th anniversary in 2016. This is a brand new pressing, which I ordered from Amazon last week for €30, which according to the cover was made in Poland. It's a decent 180-gram pressing, but my copy did have a few small bumps in the vinyl which were audible between one of the tracks, but that's modern vinyl for you. Perhaps the best way to listen to this album today, and one I really enjoy, is in Dolby Atmos. It was created by Giles Martin in 2023, and in my opinion, he did a really amazing job. So if you have Dolby Atmos or a compatible set of headphones, I strongly urge you to listen to this mix. You won't be disappointed. Other Beach Boys albums are also being made available on this format, and they're certainly worth investigating too. The Disney documentary did what it set out to do, but of course was never going to be long enough or detailed enough to satisfy everybody. But anything that brings the Beach Boys music back to the mainstream must be encouraged. And if one person discovers or listens to Pet Sounds for the first time as a result of this video, then I'm happy. Do let me and everyone else know what you think about this album and what your favourite sounding version is. This UK reel-to-reel, by the way, is terrible. Also, let me know if you'd like me to do more Beach Boys videos and I'll add them to my ever-growing list. I'll be back next week with another video on the Rolling Stones. So to get yourself in the mood for that, why not watch another of our videos about them? But that's all for this one, so I'll say bye for now and thanks for watching.